This is the Back in the Day podcast, unscripted stories from the old neighborhood. And talking again with a Passyunk Square, long-term Passyunk Square resident, Anastacia, South Philadelphia. She's got a cool story to tell about the home she has been in for quite some time and how it got built the way it got built. I talked last time about the fact that sometimes these homes in South Philly and Passyunk Square and others are accused of being sort of non-unique. They all look the same. They're all either 2 or 3 story. They're 14 to 17 feet wide, and they're cookie cutter, even back in the day. Well, guess what? Hers isn't. It's different, and she'll tell you why. And then she's going to talk about this was really getting to the feel and flavor of what we're looking for in this podcast. And she tells us from her experiences what the kind of who the vendors were on the block and what the block kind of looked and felt like from a commercial perspective. The pizza guy and the pretzel guy and the milk deliveries and all the stuff that some of us think about when we talk about back in the day and how things used to be. She was there and she tells stories about what that looked and felt like. So great stuff. Thanks for being with us, and thanks for tuning in to Back in the Day.
Well, Anastacia, thanks for giving us your time today.
Sure.
My wife and I and little Mickey, who's 8, have lived here since 2009, I guess. And I've seen a lot of changes, and I'm really intrigued about what it used to be like back in the day. And I'm in the real estate business, and I help people move into the neighborhood pretty often, and I always wondered if they would be interested in knowing a little more about what it was like back in the day, and I think they would.
I think so too. I think that when you get such a turnover of people, the stories just get lost.
Yeah, very good point.
Yep.
So thanks again for taking a minute to tell us about what it was like back in the day. So I've got Anastacia from 13th in Mifflin. So how long have you been there?
Since 1985.
Wow.
So
cool.
Good way. 35 years.
So you weren't born there, I guess.
No, I was not born here, nor was my husband. But the reason why I reached out to you is because our house has a specific, interesting history that I think is getting lost. Are you familiar with our block of homes?
Yeah, I live around the corner.
Okay, so you might notice that our house is closer to Broad Street, and a little bit larger than the other homes that are on the block.
Yep.
Our house was built by the builder for his own house, and he built all the other homes on the block in 1892.
How about that?
So when we moved in, when we uncovered some wallpaper, the original date from the plaster that was February 1892, which was really cool. So we tried to keep that. But what's most interesting to me is that have you ever heard of Mario Lanza?
Sure.
Okay. So Mario Lanza was born in Philadelphia, and he also trained in Philadelphia before he went on to be an opera star. And he trained from Rodolfo Pili, Pili, and our house was known as the Pili House. So Rodolfo Pili was a opera however you say that word.
Impresario.
Yeah.
You got it before I got it.
And he and his wife was a soprano. Her name was Marion. I forget. Gloria Marion. But in any case, Rodolfo and Gloria lived here in this house from the late 1920s to about 1970. And he had an opera school, and that was on the second floor, like a little kind of a ballroom. And that's where Mario Lanza studied.
That is something else.
So that to me is really interesting. And then also the Gloria Marion, who was the soprano, his wife, she was pretty active. And there's a little table in the restaurant on Victor's Cafe that's, I guess, on Tasker Street or Dickinson. And I forget what table it is. I think it's number 21, but next to it, it has a little picture of her that says Gloria Marion. So it had like a nice little history of opera down in this neighborhood. But,
That's really neat.
you know, then flash forward to when we moved in, it was predominantly old Italian families that had been here for, you know, many generations, just passing the houses on.
Yeah.
But there's a couple things that I remember. There used to be a pretzel guy that would just walk the streets with his cart of warm pretzels. And this was back in like the mid 80s. And he would just stroll the streets shouting, "Pretzels, hot pretzels." And people would come out of their houses. And I think the pretzels were from Federal Pretzels on Federal Street.
Yep.
But he was just a vendor that would walk the streets, and he did that for a few years and then just sort of disappeared. But also at the same time, there was another guy that used to sell flowers, and he had a flower cart. And he kept his flower cart down on Mifflin Street in a garage. And it was an older black man that had not a grocery cart, but more like a cart, sort of Italian market style.
Mm-hmm.
And he would just walk up and down the streets and call out, "Flowers, flowers." And people would come out and they would buy flowers and hot pretzels. So those are like some really early memories I had when we first moved in here.
It reminds me of some stories I've heard about where there was a lot more home delivery. Right? Of milk and deli items and bread and all kinds of stuff, I guess, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Across the street from us was the Carabello family had a small deli / meat market, and Mama lived across the street on my side of the street in the 1300 block. But his son Nate was always making deliveries, and he would just load up his grocery cart, like an Acme cart, and he was always on the street making deliveries of fresh meat. One night we needed some fresh meat, and Tony's light was on, so Scott, my husband, went over, and he asked him if he had anything. He says, "I don't have anything, but let me cut you something." So he took him to the side of, I guess it was like 1331. It says a little corner property, and there's an entrance on the side that used to be where they would hang and dry meat. And he opened up the side door, and there was this huge cow carcass that was just hanging there. And he just cut his piece off for Scott. So
that's great. That's great. What service? What a level of service you got back then?
Oh, I know it.
That's great. So was the block, did it feel different back in, the mid 80s than it does today? What are the differences that you notice on the block?
I don't notice a huge difference, because I think that because we're sort of at the end of the block, we're a little bit removed. It's not like when you live down Watt Street.
Right. Yes, agreed.
But I don't see a big difference, other than Bobby and Marcia, who used to live next door, and they moved away.
Yeah.
There's not a huge difference. There's the house across the street, which was Eleanor's. She was there for years and years, and it sold maybe just 5 years ago. So a family bought it, they renovated it, and they just resold it. So there's new younger families with more money are coming in, but we still have a lot of the stable old families that are here living now with the grandkids. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, would you say you know most of the people on the block, at least to say hello, or at least know their names?
I would say no. I would say I know my immediate neighbors and just introduce myself to the ones across the street, and I know the ones behind me. I know a few on Juniper and a few on Watt Street, just old timies. But there's a little bit less community today than there was back then. I mean, back then you could walk down the street and most people would be sitting out front, having coffee clashes with their neighbors and gossiping. There's a lot less of that today.
I've observed that, and some others have said the same thing. I'm fascinated by what it must have been like in the 60s, 70s, 80s, which, in my estimate, or what I've heard, at least is and read about, is a much more vibrant, on the block type experience where people were spending a lot of time outside with the neighbors.
Yes. Yeah, and especially in the warmer weather when most people don't have air conditioning.
Yeah.
So they would just be forced to, try to get a cool breeze.
Well, that was my next question is what did people do to stay cool? And it sounds like they just did their best to stay outside.
Yeah. So when we first moved here, there was a couple of young kids that would live up on Watt Street, and their parents would come down and open up the fire hydrant, and they would play in the fire hydrant. That's about it. I think that for like a richer neighborhoody street, you might have to go to like a less traveled street, like Juniper or Watt. One of the ones where there's more kids. There never were a lot of children on this street. So I think that also played a part.
Yeah. Right. So we live on McClellan, and right around a corner from you. And yeah, we pretty much know everyone. And it is nice that it's so few, there's so less traffic that we really can kind of spend time outside and not be as worried as you should be or would be on a wider block. Yet the houses are smaller.
Yeah, exactly.
That's always the trade-off. The quieter blocks are the tiny houses. So.
But it seems more intimate. Yeah, the quieter blocks with the small houses are more intimate.
It is a little more intimate. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, people will zoom down Broad Street. They'll make that turn real fast on Mifflin, and kids just really can't play outside if they were in the street.
That's true. Do you remember any neighbors spending a lot of time in the basement doing the cooking?
Our kitchen used to be in the basement, so there was when we first moved in, we brought the kitchen upstairs. But Bobby and Marcia did a lot of cooking, but on the first floor, and then he had the garage down the street where he had winemaking. No, I don't have a memory of other neighbors in the basement.
I have a neighbor, older woman who unfortunately passed a few years back, but she apparently did a lot of cooking in the basement, and we had an opportunity to see the house after it began to get ready to get sold to another resident and tenant, and there was a whole mess of cooking equipment down there. It was pretty well set up. Wow. I don't think it was a commercial usage, but I think maybe it could have been. It was pretty good setup down there.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah. So 85 or so, do you remember if Bobby and Marcia were using the stable at all for anything else besides that bar he had eventually?
Oh, so that was not their property until when did they buy that? I'm going to say they bought that maybe 2010.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah. So as long as I've been here, the stable is such an interesting property. God, I would love to buy that. Yeah. The people who used it were cabinet refinishers and woodworkers.
Okay.
And that's who used it for as long as I can remember when we first moved in.
Oh, great. Really interesting spot. You'd never know it's back there.
I know. I just love it. Have you heard any word what they're doing with it?
So my friend Steve bought it, and he's had it for, I want to say 4 years or so. And they were going to do a boutique hotel with like a community feel. And it just turned out to be a little bit too big of a change in use for the space, and was going to be too big of a push to get zoning. So they gave up on the idea, and also difficult to get it financed, and it was kind of a new idea in a neighborhood that had nothing like that. So it was kind of a push. So they gave up. He tried to resell it. Hasn't resold. It's still sitting there. So that is what it is. So what about the avenue? Was that different 34 years ago?
Yeah, back in the 80s, the avenue, every single property was in use. You had Harriet's Bra Shop. There was Phillips Mancuso's was always there. Every single place was full. There were clothing stores, poultry stores, grocery stores. Every single building had something in it. So that was a very vital shopping area.
And would it be common to go anywhere else to shop, or was that it?
Well, you also had on Broad Street, the Woolworths was here. So that was like your big option. And Woolworths was just grand back in the 80s because they had the, like a little diner restaurant on the first floor, and you could get your 75-cent hot dog and little milkshake, and then go downstairs and buy your goldfish. So it was just a great place to shop. After they left, I believe it was a Kresge's, so it was still sort of a discount department store. Mm-hmm. And now it is, totally different. The banks were always there. Prudential Savings Bank used to be on the corner of Broad and Mifflin. And then across the street where it's just apartments now on the northeast corner of Broad and Mifflin, it used to be a doctor's office. Mm-hmm. And then Buddy Sanfrani, I don't know if you remember that name, but he was a politician. He lived on the second floor.
Okay.
So it was mostly doctor's offices.
What building was Woolworths? You remember?
Oh, yeah. Well, so Woolworths was in the Rite Aid.
Got it. Okay.
The current Rite Aid.
Makes sense. How about that? So we think that it's interesting to have, Walmart have a little mini food court or McDonald's or whatever in there, something new and different. Yet Woolworths had that 40 years ago.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yes.
Look, that's cool. We think we're doing such monumental changes these days, and sometimes we just kind of go back to what it used to be.
Yeah, so true.
That's interesting. Well, what is there anything else I should have asked you and didn't?
Well, when we moved down here in the 1980s, there was a lot of mob wars going on. Mm. There were a lot of shootouts. There was a major mob hangout that was Joey Marlino. Mm-hmm. And he was if you came down Mifflin and you made a right on Juniper Street and went all the way to the end, it was just kind of there where right now I think there's a pizzeria, but that was his mob hangout. And,
okay.
Back in the day, I would take my daughter to go get her shoes because there was a little kids shoe store on the avenue. Mm-hmm. We were always warned not to go down Juniper Street because there were often drive-by shootings at Joey's. So we would make the little long trip around and take the long route.
That's fascinating. And, it feels like to me that block of Juniper has not been as fast to turn around as some others. I wonder if there's a legacy there.
Yes, it's funny. I think if you were to go to like BRT and start to look at the homes, I think a lot of the homes are still in the same family. Mm-hmm. And maybe they passed and a couple of them have deteriorated. Mm-hmm. A couple of them have changed hands and the last selling was pretty expensive. I think one sold for like $450, and that seems like a lot to me for a little 2-story.
They're little
on that block.
They're little.
Yeah, I know.
So that coffee shop that Joey Merlino would go to, was it a functioning coffee shop, or you kind of couldn't go in?
It was like a coffee club. So you really couldn't go in to get your coffee. It was like their club hangout, sort of like I think there's a little hangout that's currently now on the other side of Passyunk Avenue.
Well, it's on the corner of 13th and Sigil is that coffee shop, which used to be open, yet you knew you kind of shouldn't go in there.
Right. Yeah, that was kind of like Joey's. Only I don't think that it was even tempting to go in. Usually the men would be sitting out front, gossiping. Mm-hmm.
Wasn't that inviting for folks who weren't on the inside?
No, yes, you knew that was not a place to go.
You just could tell, right? Nobody had to tell you. You just could tell that probably wasn't a spot you're going to grab your latte. Keep on going down the street and go somewhere else.
Exactly.
Well, that was great, Anastacia. You enlightened us and gave us some reminders about how things used to be on the block with your building, with vendors, and with the streets and how they used to lay out and function. So that was awesome. Great to hear. Thanks for participating. This has been Back in the Day podcast, unscripted stories from the old neighborhood. Have your own story to tell of life back in the day? Know someone else who does? Reach out to us. You can find our contact info below in the show notes. This is Mickey Pasquarella signing off. See you next time.